So now turning to the star of this keynote session, I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Knudsen, who is the CEO of the American Cancer Society and its advocacy affiliate. A well-respected cancer leader, researcher, and advocate, Dr. Knudsen guides the ACS on their mission to save lives, celebrate lives, and lead the fight for a world without cancer. That sounds like a big task. She has a strong commitment to ensuring that all people can benefit from the impact of their work. Dr. Knudsen holds a PhD and an MBA, and prior to joining the ACS, Dr. Knudsen served as Executive Vice President of Oncology Services and the Enterprise Director for the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center at Jefferson Health. She holds many other leadership roles, including serving on the Board of Advisors for the NCI and many other boards. She previously served as president of the Association of American Cancer Institutes and on the Board of Directors of the AACR. She's active within several committees in ASCO and is very much a long-term friend of ASCO GU. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Knudsen.
Well, thank you so much, GU friends. It's wonderful to be back at ASCO GU. I had the pleasure of chairing the last live meeting in 2020, and I just can't say how wonderful it is to get to see you again in person. Before I start, I do want to just touch quickly upon the ASCO-ACS collaboration. As ACS's newest CEO, this is one that's really important to me, and that relationship between our two organizations is just such a natural fit and was clearly the right thing to do. I had the honor of being at the White House 2 weeks ago alongside Dr. Hudis, the CEO of ASCO, as President Biden gave out his new priorities toward improving the lives of cancer patients and their families, which is actually our ACS's goal. And one of the things that he asked us to do is to work together more closely, more deeply than ever, all of the major cancer organizations. So Dr. Hudis and I got a chance to look at each other, have a high five, and say, you know, we're already well on our path. And this collaboration that we have in the harmonization of cancer.org and cancer.net is just the first in what I hope will be a series of steps to allow us to empower patients to ask the right questions and to understand or avoid their cancer journey. So thank you all of ASCO, as well as Dr. Hudis, for that. So for today's keynote lecture, it is my privilege to address something that I think we've heard about at this meeting that's important to all of us, and that is improving cancer care equity, or equity in cancer care outcomes. And so what I'd like to do is to give you a macro view of where I think we are as a GU field, and invite commentary about what I have highlighted based on the data we've seen so far with regard to priorities. Okay, I do have some disclosures, none of which are relevant to today's discussion. Okay, so a little bit about the American Cancer Society, just in brief, because I think it does relate to what it is we'll discuss. So why do we exist? The American Cancer Society exists because of something I know we all agree upon in this room, and that is that the burden of cancer is unacceptably high in the US as well as globally. And so our mission simply is to improve the lives of cancer patients and their families. And we view our scope as something very similar to the scope of ASCO, which is what makes us such well-aligned partners. Everything from prevention and early detection to new treatment modalities, and we've heard about exciting ones already at this meeting, all the way through survivorship for those 16.9 million survivors in this country alone that was just discussed. So what is the problem that we are trying to solve? So this is, in the context of the United States, the problem that we wake up every day at the American Cancer Society thinking about. The 1.9 million new cancer cases per year that are diagnosed every year in this country, and the more than 600,000 deaths per year in the US alone. So we've taken a tripartite approach in this latest, era for the American Cancer Society to address these issues, and I want to share a little bit of that with you. So you heard about the 3 pillars of ASCO. We're also a 3-pillar organization, and again, very well aligned. We are very common in advocacy, but also our pillars lie in discovery and patient support. Our advocacy group is located at ACS CAN, and I thank all of you here who are involved in ACS CAN, is located in Washington, D.C., but with a presence in all 50 states in the U.S. Our Discovery Center is housed in Atlanta. We are much like the National Institutes of Health. We have our own intramural research program as well as extramural program that funds grants across the country. But until we solve the problem of cancer, we strongly believe that we have to be your best ally in the cancer centers that you serve by providing direct patient support in the form of education, transportation, lodging, navigation because it's not reimbursed, as well as engaging in prevention and screening programs in 5,000 communities across the country. So when I look at this map, I am happy to see how well we are covering the United States, but also see much opportunity, and this will relate to today's talk about where we can and need to do more. So where the data comes from today that I'm going to show you is actually a highlight of our intramural program. So you were introduced already today to Dr. Jamal, who will be leading that virtual poster session, which I would encourage all to attend. Our own intramural program within the American Cancer Society, in part, is focused very much on understanding trends in cancer. And we view it as one of our responsibilities to report out to the nation every year where we are doing well and where opportunity lies. I'd like to thank Dr. Jamal and his team for not only helping to pull together all of the data for this presentation, but also for providing the single book of truth in the U.S. across the country about cancer facts and figures. This is every year the most widely cited publication in all of oncology. Even our most recent release is now more than 90,000 publications, and I think everyone in this room at some point in time has probably cited Jamal et al. So thank you to Dr. Jamal and his team for this incredible work that you do, which sets the tone for our research priorities. So you also may have seen this slide, which is one that we update, and this is the yearly, and this is the most recent information that we have about trends in cancer mortality for men on the left and women on the right. Now, before there was a formidable increase in research funding, which occurred circa 1991, you saw that we were on a very steep slope when it came to cancer deaths for both men and women. Red is what that slope would have looked like had we kept going on the same trajectory. Blue is what we actually realized. And we believe, based on data that we have and that all of you have contributed to, that that decline in cancer mortality has arrived as a result of both research, which allowed us to have breakthroughs in prevention, detection, and cure, but also in access to care that came in the form of advocacy. So these are incredibly important observations for us, and that's led to a 32% decline in mortality in the US since this doubling down of investment in cancer research. This is really important, but also the slope of that curve is important. It started off at a 0.5% year-over-year reduction in mortality, then a 1%, and now we're at a 2% roll. So this is progress and something that we should celebrate. When we bring that down to real lives, that's more than 3.5 million deaths averted due to progress from individuals such as those sitting here in this auditorium today and with us online for the GU meeting. Yet we are not quite satisfied, and we'll talk about that in the rest of the talk. The American Cancer Society plays a large role in ensuring that we are filling the gaps in cancer research, including clinical research as well as translational discovery. Since that 1991 time point when we've started to flatten the curve for mortality, we have given more than $3.1 billion alone in cancer research funding. We are the largest funder of cancer research outside the US government in this country, and we aim to do more. Yet we know, as much as we celebrate that 32% reduction in cancer mortality, that advances have not benefited everyone. You heard about this earlier today in the meeting, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples here. At the top is all cancer death rates, just comparing whites in gray and blacks in red within the United States. And you can see that we have a lot to do to achieve equitable outcome. And where there are cancers that are the focus of today, prostate, we're going to talk a lot more about, but it's not just in the GU cancers. I also included the breast cancer profile there. We have much work yet to do. Now, we know that there are a large number of cancer disparities, and I would argue that we've understood what many of these are, and we need to move beyond continuing to study the problem and get to implementation. This is in part what our patient support pillar does. This is the lack of transportation, lack of housing, not sexy, yet in this country accounts for a significant fraction of cancer disparities. There are gaps in digital and health literacy that needs to be addressed. We talked about financial toxicity at this meeting many times and intensively at this GU ASCO meeting. Lack of access to coverage and quality care is a major barrier. Hesitation to enroll in clinical trials, and we also heard about that at this meeting earlier from Dr. Yamoa, as well as unconscious bias from providers and health systems. Let's take these to be truths that we know exist and we need to move beyond through implementation strategies. So I don't want to underscore the importance, I don't want to overlook the importance of these. But what I'd like to do for the rest of the talk is to zoom out and take a macro look of understanding that this is a playing field problem across all cancers. What interesting or unexpected trends do we see in GU cancers when it comes to mortality and incidence? So let's look overall at the US and understand that starting from the 70s when our country's war on cancer became announced by then President Nixon, that there has been a large shift in where it is that cancer mortality rates occur in the United States, which had been truly all across the country and now really clustering in various areas, so that we know overall there is a shift in regionality of where cancer mortality actually is enriched. And what I'd like to do is take the US as a model of study, understanding it is not all about the United States, but this is where we can gather our most intensive data to look at trends. I'd like to look at the current trends in the GU cancers for incidence and mortality, as well as our current state of knowledge for disparities, with the goal for developing calls for action for both research and implementation. So let's go back to the problem we're trying to solve and drill down on the GU cancers. So they are of high incidence. So the GU cancers account in this country alone for more than 409,000 new cancer cases per year, and I think remarkably accounts for more than 1/5 of all new cancers in this country per year. This is a challenge. There is also significant mortality associated with the GU cancers. Just for men, looking at prostate and bladder cancer, this accounts for more than 46,000 deaths per year, and that's more than 14% of all male cancer deaths in this country. So the problem and the burden of GU cancers is significant. There are also concerning trends for women, and we're going to talk about those. So this is what I'd like us to keep in mind as we think about the problems to solve. So to be fair, I took these in alphabetical order. We'll focus on 4 GU cancers, and I'd love to get feedback from this group of where we agree and where I may have omitted something that you think should be a priority based on the trends that you're seeing in your own practices. And again, I'd like to thank Dr. Jamal and team who curated these data for us, largely using the CDC and SEER database assessments. So let's look at bladder cancer. So there are 4 major groups we're able to derive data from. NHW is non-Hispanic white, always in black. Hispanic is blue, and non-Hispanic black is orange, and Asian Pacific Islander in gray. So what do we know about bladder cancer? So certainly there's disproportionately high in white men in this country. We know about risks. We know that smoking accounts for somewhere between 40 and 50% of the mortality. There's an occupational hazard risk which contributes to these data, but that risk has increased over time due to enhancing toxins in cigarettes. Now, females have a very different incidence level plotted on the same curve when it comes to bladder cancer. So what we see when we look at bladder cancer incidence are significant disparities, where the risk is 4 times higher in men versus women and 2 times higher in blacks versus whites. If we look at trends, we know that incidence is declining at a faster rate in white men versus others, and we speculate, but have not been able to demonstrate yet, that this may be attributed to reduced occupational hazard. We also know that incidence is declining at a faster rate in black women versus other. Good job, black women. And what could be accounting for that? While we can't give proof positive to this, what we do know is that smoking in that generation now, which would be presenting with bladder cancer, was at the lowest rate for black females. So we think that this may be contributing to that decrease in black females with bladder cancer. So what about mortality? So again, some significant disparities here to discuss. So the mortality rates are 3 to 4 times higher in men versus women. And you may say to yourself, okay, well, that is largely attributed to the incidence rates also being of a similar type of split. However, what I do want to call out, which is surprising to us, is this is distinct from what is now being observed in lung cancer, where the genders are in fact converging. There's also been a steady decline in mortality rates for Black men, and a higher mortality rate in white men, which is again distinct from those lung cancer profiles. Calling into question, is what we're seeing in these trends different than what is attributed to cancer from smoking? And these are those lung cancer trends I was speaking of, with the convergence of men and women, and also a higher mortality rate in blacks versus whites for men, so distinct from what we're seeing in bladder cancer. Now, when we look at regionality, and this is a heat map across the United States with incidence on the left and mortality on the right, I would say these are somewhat unremarkable. I would certainly welcome a collaboration with the American Cancer Society and others to dig into any areas that you think are interesting that we have not yet looked at. But from that macro view, from the zoom out view, the incidence and the mortality rates appear to reflect each other. So what do we think we may take home from these data? From research, we may ask ourselves, in terms of risk factors, is there something that we are missing? And again, that comes from that distinction between where the profiles are going for men and women in lung cancer versus bladder cancer. Now, we also know that there is no current screening method for individuals of average risk. We're also, on the other hand, watching the development of multi-cancer early detection tests, and we anxiously await firm demonstration that these tests actually show clinical benefit. If they do, perhaps this is an opportunity for bladder cancer to be detected earlier. We also believe that there's a potential call to action to understand why it is that there's such a gender disparity in outcome for men versus women. Again, that's getting wider in bladder cancer and yet converging in lung cancer. And understanding the higher mortality in white men, which is again distinct from lung cancer. Without question, though, there are things that we can do right now, which is to enhance tobacco cessation strategies. As we know, this accounts for bladder cancer incidence. So let's move on then to kidney cancer. So what do we see here? So different than what we saw in bladder cancer. Now, for all groups, what we are seeing is a long-term, steady increase in incidence, and this is largely localized stage diagnosis, and from the best available data, appears to be partially attributed to incidental detection of asymptomatic tumors through increased medical imaging. So there's a slow but steady increase. It's across gender, it's across demographics, so very different than what we saw with bladder cancer. So what could be the call to action here? We would suggest that the call to action here, in fact, is prevention, because about half of kidney cancers that are reported now could be prevented through eliminating strong risk factors to this disease, which include excess body weight, tobacco smoking. Now, what about survival? So this we split out into looking at the different subtypes of kidney cancer. And while not shown here, something I do want to call out here is that mortality actually has been declining since the mid-1990s, in part because of the incredible work from the group represented here. There's been, in addition, a decline in accelerating that decrease. So about a 2.5% decrease year over year from 2015 to 2019. So well done. This is something to celebrate. The mortality level in Black men in the US is actually something that's interesting and that we should probably study and look at a little bit more. So the mortality rate is relatively level, despite a higher overall incidence rate. What does that mean? What is accounting for that? It's worthy of study. And so this is something that we can really then take a success story, learn from, and hopefully improve even further. When it comes to regional distribution as well, I would call this relatively unremarkable, but again, invite commentary of where it is that we may want to dig into these data further. So what do we think for kidney cancer based on the data we presented here? Would suggest that research for understanding the higher incidence without higher mortality in Black men is probably worthy of study. Are there additional risk factors beyond what it is that we can already ask patients to avoid just through their own behavior and lifestyle modification? And also, what I didn't mention is, of course, but I hope you saw in the data, was a lower incidence in Asian and Pacific Islanders. And what is really counting for that? Reminding ourselves that we need to study what's going really well in addition to a trend that is alarming. So what can we do right now? Of course, this is promotion of healthy lifestyles and prevention strategies at our primary care clinics. So now let's move on to prostate cancer. Lots to unpack here. So these are the trends for incidence, which of course were in this country significantly impacted by screening guidelines. So as you have heard at this meeting before and you see now, incidence is highest in Black men in this country. But if you look at the slope of the line between these particular years, you see something very interesting, which is a significant decline in incidence. And this is when the U.S. Prevention Task Force recommended against screening. We believe we are now seeing some of the repercussions of those recommendations. So what we see in this overall current plot is a 73% higher incidence in Black men versus whites for reasons that truly still remain unclear. Now you could ask, is this due to screening? I didn't include these data on the slide, but the latest screening data that we have, which goes through 2018, indicates two things. One, in this country, screening rates for Black men and white men are approximately equal, but they are also remarkably low. So for all men who are eligible for prostate cancer screening, for Black men it was 33% of them uptake screening and 37% for white men. So while they may be equitable, I don't think that we can celebrate only 1/3 of men uptaking prostate cancer screening. So that's clearly not what's accounting for these data. The incidence rates, as I mentioned, were significantly impacted by those changing guidelines, and let's look at what the outcomes then turned out to be. So now let's split out by stage. So if we look at localized stage, you start to see this uptick in incidence. This is a resumption in screening after the guidelines were readjusted. This also is reflected in the regional stage. But where we're seeing the most dramatic shift is new diagnosis for distant stage prostate cancer, accounting for a 4 to 6% annual increase in advanced disease since 2011. To us at the American Cancer Society, this is a call to arms. So while it is that overall change is not distinct from year to year, that increase in a shift to later stage disease really does give us significant concern and is likely to result in increased mortality. So let's look at mortality. So mortality rates for Blacks, whites, Hispanics, and Asian Pacific Islanders are shown here. And for all groups, mortality declines are flattening. In other words, we made a lot of progress, but now that progress is starting to slow. Why? Is it saturation in testing and the types of testing or imaging modalities that we use here in the United States? Is there something that we need to refine in terms of screening? And or do we need to change our therapeutic strategies? You know, we heard earlier in the meeting about triplet therapy. Maybe this is part of the solution to this flatlining in our progress against preventing prostate cancer death. So I look to your ideas and insight into that. So screening refinement as well as research intensification for new therapeutic strategies we believe is called for based on these data. Now let's look at regional variations. This is just for white men. So we're going to go state by state so you can look at the mortality rates. Again, where low incidence is in blue and a higher incidence is in orange. So when we look at these data, we see trends that we did not expect. Again, this is the rates per 100,000 residents for white men alone. So I'll call out some of the bigger states with high populations. So if you look at Florida, what you see is a relative balance between incidence and mortality. It's relatively low in the state. And so one could argue, that state has a good handle on how it is to handle prostate cancer. But when you look at California, this is some of the data. Since I picked it out since we're standing here in the middle of this state, or at the top of this state, with the lowest incidence yet the highest mortality. So how is that happening? What is accounting for these regional variances? I look to the group to give me some insight about what could be driving that. And that's just within white men in the country. But now let's compare Black men and white men. And we see, again, a very different profile in outcomes. So, for example, please forgive me if I've called out your state. I'm just trying to give good examples here. But examples that we may want to look at are the Carolinas, for both North Carolina and South Carolina, where there's significantly higher mortality rates for Black men in those states, versus other states like Texas or New York, again, a high population, but approximately equitable outcomes when it comes to mortality rate for white and Black men. Something for us to study and understand. We know part of that is access to care. But again, remember, that's the foundational component that we agreed at the beginning was applying everywhere equally. So let's look at what it is that we think these data may be telling us. For research, I think that we can argue that we need more precise screening guidelines. We perhaps need to address screening saturation and new therapeutics beyond AR or inclusive of AR in a triplet therapy like we heard about yesterday. For implementation, we definitely need to use evidence-based screening to uptake this reversal to reverse this shift in diagnosis that we're seeing toward more advanced disease. We need to address disparities in outcome by region and demographic. Is that access to screening? Is it access to care? What else may be underlying that? I also added some yesterday after seeing some very thoughtful talks here at ASCO GU of addressing the underutilization of germline testing in localized disease, and would refer you back to the exceptional presentation by Dr. Loeb, as well as clinical trials variations in uptake from Dr. Yamoa, and there's also was a poster on this yesterday. So there's a lot for us to unpack and do better with here with the context of prostate cancer. So lastly, let's take up the cause of testicular cancer. This really surprised me and gave us some very interesting data that are, again, a call to arms and action. So we know that testicular cancer risk there's much to learn there. We know that in utero exposures contribute. There's some data that suggests that tobacco and marijuana use may contribute, but there's still much more work needs to be done. And when you look at these data, I hope what you see is something that stands out that did not stand out in the other GU cancers, and that is the alarming rise in the Hispanic population for both incidence and mortality of testicular cancer. So this is steady rise, has continued year over year. So there's a significant call to action here as well to increase screening, to increase awareness, and truly understand new risk factors. I had a really phenomenal set of scientific conversations yesterday with a new medical student who has abstract 409. I would urge you to go look at her data, suggesting that urbanization may be contributing to this rise in testicular cancer in the Hispanic community. So what is the basis of this disparity, I think, is fertile ground for investigation. We also see, like prostate cancer, but unlike bladder cancer and kidney cancer, some significant regional variations. So for example, I'll pick out different states this time. If you look at Louisiana, there's that balance of very low mortality, low incidence rates in that state. But what about Arizona? The lowest incidence, but the highest mortality. So what is happening in that state is something that we certainly need to address. So when it comes to testicular cancer, without question, we need to understand the basis for this dramatic rise in the Hispanic population, and also understand the basis for these significant regional variations. But in the right now, we can increase awareness and we can increase screening uptake. And I will commit to you as the CEO of the American Cancer Society, now that we have come to this realization, we will be part of that solution in the states that have this high incidence, and partnering with the rest of you and academic medicine to raise awareness about how one detects testicular cancer. So in summary, this is where I think we have learned from taking that macro view and understanding that there are a large number of factors that contribute to cancer disparities, but that if we take those as a truth across all of the GU cancers, we still see variations that require investigation. I'll remind you where we started, that GU cancers are a significant burden, accounting for over 1/5 of all new cancers diagnosed per year in this country, and that the deaths from prostate cancer and male bladder cancer alone account for more than 14% of all male cancer deaths. Our trends and disparities are different, cancer to cancer. The gender disparity is something that we need to address for both bladder and kidney cancer, obviously not relevant for prostate cancer or testicular cancer. Our racial and ethnic challenges are distinct by different subgroups dependent on the cancer. For bladder cancer, the disproportionate burden on white males. In kidney cancer, much to unpack there. There's a lot of great news in kidney cancer because of the brilliant minds in this room, but also some successes we can learn from to try to understand how that might imprint on other groups. For prostate cancer, the disproportionate burden on Black men is, with regard to both incidence and mortality, is something we need to address, and for testicular cancer, the Hispanic population. We also see that in prostate and in testicular cancer, there are significant regional variations that we do not understand. And I would submit for each of the GU cancers, fertile ground of opportunity for additional research to understand changing risk factors that may be contributing to the trends that we see. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for your participation in this incredible symposium. I'd like to thank Dr. Jamal and his team for combing through immense amounts of data for us to look at these trends and give you the latest possible information in this country across demographic, region, as well as with regard to gender. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer questions.